Yes, fantastic. Brilliant. So if we go, James, you're on the slides, are you? So next slide. So the format of the session is quick introductions to myself and Javed, a little bit around the purpose of the session today, where the idea came from. We'll then be running through the general stages of a highway project, and Javed, which I'll be running through, and then Javed will talk through a more specific example of a local scheme, an active travel scheme, and then we'll have those Q questions and answers. So next slide, James, please, and again. So I'm Alistair Gordon, a director at Arup, and I'm also the transport SME for the Delivery Associates. I've got over 25 years of experience and a lot of experience of being involved in highway schemes, both in an urban environment, but also major highway schemes as well, and at all stages of the scheme, so from very early planning all the way through to design. And I've got schemes on site at the minute. So Javed, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yep, so hi everyone, I'm Javed Hussain. I'm an associate in the Transport Cities Planning and Design team at Arup. I'm also a transport and SME support for the DAN network. I've got over 20 years experience, chartered civil engineer and transport planner, and working both the private sector and local authority clients. So that's really looking at the early stages of concept, taking them through to construction and delivery. And in some way also in the middle between private and public. I guess you've got universities, which are public institutions, but also then act as a private developer. So a bit of experience around that as well.
So if we go next stage, James, yeah, so it was interesting. The idea for today's presentation came from a session I attended as part of the Delivery Associates, which went through the REBA stages. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be useful to do something quite similar for highways? Having come up with that idea of going through, the stages and the things you should consider at each stage, what I would say is it's been quite complex in terms of, or more complicated than I thought it maybe would be in terms of preparing this presentation. And sorry, I should say we will follow up this one. We'll issue the slides to everybody, but secondly, we are doing a note that will accompany it, and we've started the note, but we'll refine it with any Q&As if there are certain things people are interested in. What we hope is that this is a useful guide and the sort of things you should consider at each stage. But it is worth saying that there is some flexibility. So we will be saying, like, at this stage, you should do this. There are, and that depends on kind of the specifics of the scheme and the circumstances. So there might be certain things you want to do a bit earlier or a bit later. But I think this is a useful, hopefully a useful guide for the sorts of things you should be considering and when. So if we go to the next slide, James. So yeah, this is a typical project life cycle. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are a number of, for certain, types of schemes, there are certain life cycles that people work to. So for Network Rail, there's GRIP, there's PACE. For buildings, it tends to be REBA. So what we've tried to do is come up with a similar sort of different stages and the sorts of things you should consider at those different stages. Next slide, please, James. And this will be on each of the slides. So I'm not going to run through it here, but this is the different stages that we'll be talking through. And as I say, for each of these stages, we'll be running through the sorts of things that we believe you should be considering at that stage, and some kind of also hopefully playing in some of the experience we've got from working on the Delivery Associates about lessons learned from some of the projects we've been involved in. So if we go to the next stage, please. So right at the start is being clear about why we're doing whatever we're doing. What's that need for the intervention? And is it local community needs and wants? Are there issues with the existing highways, particularly in terms of road safety? Does it respond to specific development, kind of unlocking those developments, or does it align with certain adopted plans and growth strategies? And there's just some images at the bottom which show some of those in action and in real life. But I think it is really getting that clear at the start about what are the issues you're trying to resolve. What is this scheme trying to, as I say, resolve and deal with is really, really important, and getting buy-in for that. So the next one, James, is then flowing from that is very much coming up with then those project aims and objectives. You could do that in a smart way, and I would say that it's beneficial is coming up with those objectives, as you can, is almost agreeing a sort of a governance board. So who are the key people that are going to help drive this scheme forward, and as part of that governance board, getting their buy-in to those objectives of, one, as I say, what the scheme's trying to address or resolve the issues, but secondly, what are those objectives? And getting that real clarity and buy-in, I think, is really key to a successful scheme and delivery. And if you can, coming up with some metrics and kind of those smart objectives, which look at the outcomes and the benefits and measuring the schemes against them. So next slide, please, James. Have we touched on the governance board and kind of getting that mandate to proceed, to making the case for change? There is something here, obviously, around funding and where are you getting funding and the need to align that case to change with potential funding agreements, but also making sure that it aligns with policies and targets. And again, sorry, what I think I've touched on, we're not going to delve really deeply in any sort of individual items. Each of these things probably could be a presentation itself, but there's clearly, depending on your funding, you might need to do different stages of your business case. You might have your strategic outline case at this stage, and then your outline business case at later stage, and your full business case. So at this stage, it's likely you need to think about those strategic objectives and the strategic benefits of the scheme, and getting clarity on that. The next scheme, once you've kind of agreed that there's a need and there's a scheme, it's really, really important to map out the existing issues and delving deep and understanding those. So also thinking around constraints and what it is you're working within. Those constraints might be utilities, it might be land ownership, it might be ecology, it might be heritage, but just understanding what those constraints are that you're working within, really important. Next one, James, which kind of leads on to this one, which is kind of then mapping those in a really clear way so everybody understands that as you start to think around what the different options are, what are those constraints within which you're working. And as I say, they might be environmental, ecological, also highway operational requirements, that land ownership is a key issue, drainage, flood risk, and utilities as well. So next one is, and again, we've seen quite a lot of this in terms of some of the schemes I've been involved in with the delivery associates, but just working with stakeholders. You've clearly got your statutory stakeholders, and then there's your non-statutory, but really mapping those out and getting a really key understanding of who they are, and then starting to develop a stakeholder plan. So being clear on who you're going to consult and when. And I think we've got another slide, have we, James? The next one is just starting to do that in terms of, oh no, it isn't, so maybe go back. Who those typical stakeholders might be, which in terms of kind of different, oh, here they are, yeah, different departments within the authority. There's then those statutory consultees like potentially Network Rail, National Highways, but then also those external non-statutory ones, thinking around both the public, but also the bus operators, potential rail operators, Sustrans, and really getting that key understanding. But as I say, one of it is understanding who they are. The second is coming up with a plan for when you're going to consult with them and how and what you're consulting with them on, because clearly each of them will be interested in different things and will need to know information at different stages, but really working that through in a well thought out plan is really important. James, yeah, so this scheme just shows an illustrative scheme, but what is important is that you consider different ways and different options to address the problem that you're trying to address. So this is showing a roundabout where at the minute there's not very good crossing facilities, and it just shows some different options in terms of an underpass, an at-grade and an overpass. And just kind of, this is very much the brainstorming. What are the different ways you can resolve the situation? And clearly there is another option, which would be just leaving it as is and understanding that within your business case, if you're doing that, a kind of do minimum option. So within the optioneering, typically you do some sort of multi-criteria assessment framework. There are some examples, which is the DFT's got the yeast tool. What we typically do is kind of use that as a starting point, but then look at refining it for the specifics of the scheme. So looking at, and then what you do is obviously look at all those different criteria against which you're assessing the schemes, and then score it in some sort of weighted scoring. Sorts of things you'd be looking at is alignment with the, the strategies, that strategic fit, looking at value for money. Is it affordable? And are you able, is it achievable? Are you able to deliver the scheme? And also looking at that governance. So once you've gone through that, you'll get a preferred option. This, and it does say there that discounted options may be revisited, because one of the things I think those of you that are involved in highway schemes will know is they're very iterative, and you end up refining them again and again, and it might be you end up as part of that refinement looking back again at other options that you might have discounted to the preferred option, and having that really good kind of record of why you discounted it is really important. Also in terms of consultation, when people ask, just having that really clear audit trail is important. So the next one, James is then working up that design development. And what this does show, which I think is quite important, is one of the things, Gavin might talk about this as well in terms of his urban scheme, is there are clearly design standards, whether that's LTM 120 for active travel or design manual for roads and bridges or manual for streets, often works in the urban environment, falls somewhere between some of those standards. And because you're working in a constrained environment, you're not always able to achieve them. You can see on the drawing on the right some swept path analysis, which is a really useful tool for just considering how the design works for different types of vehicles that will typically use it. It's also important as part of any sort of design that you get that independent, review and assurance. Now that might be through a road safety audit, which you've got your different stages, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 of your road safety audit, or it might just be some sort of design panel review, but you get that review of that kind of independent review of the design. So also you might consider modelling the scheme. If it's a highway scheme, what's the impact, not just on this section of the network, but maybe the broader network. And also important that you identify duty orders under the CDM regs. Consideration of when you should get surveys. So we've got there sorts of surveys that you typically get in terms of topographical survey, utility surveys, obviously traffic surveys, and ground surveys. Depending on the type of scheme, you wouldn't always necessarily get detailed ground survey if it's a very urban scheme, and you might pass that on to the contractor, or you might need it for structures, whatever, you might need it at an early stage. So next one, James, is public consultation, and this might be a requirement in terms of either your funding, or it might be a requirement in terms of planning, but obviously consulting with the people that are affected by the scheme is really important. And it might be you want to kind of get a dedicated stakeholder resource liaison officer to lead on this, depending on what came up at those earlier stages in terms of constrained stakeholder mapping. Also thinking, what is it you're consulting on, and what are the questions you want to ask? So what are the things you might be able to flex within the design that actually be really, really useful to get the opinion of people, and what are the things that actually there aren't many options. So really being clear on the purpose of the consultation and what are the things that you want people to be able to influence is really important. Also thinking about if people have raised issues and concerns, how you go back and play those back as part of the ongoing consultation is important, and we've kind of put that in terms of the kind of you said, we did thing is useful, so people can feel that they are being listened to and heard in terms of their opinions. So clearly really important at the minute when there's a lot of pressure in terms of viability of schemes is making sure you've got a handle on costs, and working through once you've got that preferred scheme, what is the cost of the scheme, depending on the stage of the scheme itself. You might want to put a risk pot and some sort of optimism bias, but it is important you consider things like utility costs and go out and get at C2 stage information on where the utilities are if you believe you might be affecting any, and then at C3 get those preliminary cost estimates to kind of play into that cost plan. And then once you're kind of working through the scheme, keep going back to that cost plan to check whether you're in it as part of those iterations is again really important. One of the things we've put at the bottom of this is consideration of, is there a benefit of some early contractor involvement? It might be on some schemes beneficial, particularly if buildability is an issue, to get some, but thinking about also how that might affect how you might come to market, and make sure if you are involving anyone, it doesn't kind of mean that they can't then tender the works at a later stage. So next scheme, James, is just, there are lots of statutory powers with public highway, and some of those might be beneficial in terms of it might allow you to do work on the highway under permitted development. Some schemes we've seen, however, through the work we've been doing, do need planning permission, and making sure that that's factored into the programme very early is important. And if it's a major scheme, then it might need EIA as well, which again further makes it, the amount of work needed even further. There are legal constraints working in the highway, and also because it's in the highway authority has certain rights in terms of approving the design and also approving the constructions, because they'll be adopting it. If there's third-party land, make sure consider land purchase and how that's going to be done, whether that's through compulsory purchase or whether that's through negotiation. And then just considering other things like, again, we've seen through the delivery associates of what's the type of area you're going through. Is it a conservation area or the World Heritage Sites, which further complicate the design again. So these are just other considerations in terms of those legal requirements, how it works. If you're affecting the traffic regulation orders, there's a need to obviously consider those and advertise the new orders. There's also those highway approvals. If you're stopping up highway, then you need to do a stopping up order. There's environmental surveys that you need to do, and there obviously there's certain seasons for undertaking certain surveys, which again, in terms of your programme, making sure that they are programmed in early, so that you make sure you don't miss any windows for when you're doing that. And the key there is at the early stage of the scheme, do a P, which is a preliminary ecological assessment, which basically advises what habitat is suitable for certain species, and it advises certain follow-on surveys, which mean you can and the key is that you do them at the right time, which means you either do have these species or don't, and if you do, then you need to then work out how you're going to deal with them within the design. We've talked about land assembly, but then also considering public rights of way is important in terms of the scheme itself. So next one, James, is as you start preparing construction information, so this is assuming that we've gone through the design, you've submitted your design to the Highway Authority through 278 section 38, that's been approved. You then start preparing your tender pack. One of the things I would say is also considering how you're going to procure the work, and you might want to do some early market engagement to and my experience is the more that you kind of warm up the market, the more that hopefully you get that kind of competitive tender and appetite. Again, I speak to a lot of contractors that if they haven't been warmed up, then they don't, they won't, tender it if it's just going out via the open market. So kind of trying to make sure you get that kind of competitive tension within the returns is really, really important. And the other thing that obviously lends itself to that is that it is a really well pulled together tender pack. So you've got within there, bill of quantities, contract, the specification, and those drawings that are really well, worked up. my tendency is that the kind of the technical detail is kind of errs on the side of probably being more fully designed, even if you go in D&B or different routes, than not, just because that again I think helps get some competitive tender from contractors if they can say you really thought it out. I'd also recommend as part of that procurement that you host interviews if you can with the contractors. That gives them an opportunity to raise TQs, but also you to raise kind of questions to them which might not have come out through the tender necessarily, so you can kind of explain the scheme and talk about key risks and the key things you want them to consider. And then obviously at the end of that, you're going to assess the tender and appoint a contractor. So in terms of construction and delivery, some of the big kind of watch it is clearly traffic management. How are you going to build this, and what are the key things building it while keeping either your town or your city or your area open? How are those businesses, impact on those local businesses going to be minimised? Is really important, because although you're obviously doing this for a long-term benefit, you need to kind of try and minimise the impact on the short term, whilst acknowledging that there will clearly be an impact. So thinking around, understanding and working with those local businesses to understand what their business needs are, and try to work around those as best that you can. Important you think about other projects and those interfaces with other projects that might be happening, and to try and minimise the overall impact on the area. Working through the statutory services and thinking about who's going to lead on any sort of utilities works is really important. Is that best handed over to the contractor, or is that best retained by either you, the authority, or the designer? Is again something that's worth doing, just where those roles and responsibilities lie. And also just thinking around where the site compound's going to be and where they're going to store materials. And also, and this probably goes back to the specification, but making sure that you don't have lots of construction vehicles parking on footpaths as you're building it. So maybe being really specific about and making sure you've thought through all of those sorts of issues to minimise the impact on the local residents and businesses, and the people who kind of drive and walk through these areas is really important. It is important also you think about obviously site supervision and how you ensure that they build as the design states, so getting that engineer but also that design sign off, and just considering unforeseen circumstances which you tend to get with most things as soon as you put a spade in the ground, but trying to plan for those as best you can. And then obviously once you've finished the work, then you get to close off, signing off the works. There will still be a maintenance period, but also thinking, and this goes back probably to earlier on, how are you going to monitor and evaluate the benefits of the scheme, and making sure that you have the surveys from beforehand, and then thinking around afterwards so you get those benefits and hopefully capture the benefits of the scheme. So next slide, James. I'm going to now have a drink of my tea and go on mute and hand over to Jabba, who will talk about some of the specifics. And then we've seen quite a few examples of these, of a kind of a typical local active travel scheme, and some of the kind of watch outs and things you need to consider for a scheme such as this.
Yeah, so thanks Ali. So I thought what we'll do in this section is probably just reflect on a lot of what Ali's taken us through, what are probably the key steps to move through the project delivery framework, and pick on a theoretical active travel scheme, which could quite equally apply to footway widening and public realm as well within the adopted highway, and then talk ourselves through one of those as an example. So James, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. So the potential types of schemes could range from something as simple as a carriageway widening into a footway or a footway build out to accommodate a change within the highway. And a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is road space reallocation. So other purposes for the same carriageway, particularly coming out of COVID, where there's been an increase in active travel trips and a reduction in, particularly in the city and town centres, more city centres than town centres, I must admit, around vehicle movements as well. So it's really taking back a lot of that urban space for more place-based interactions, as opposed to serving as a highway with a segregation facility to maintain networks. Example in the middle just shows how there are different challenges and interfaces between both pedestrians, cyclists, public transport users, dwellers in quiet spots, places and pocket parks and those things. So things to use that. And there are some examples from different places. And I guess on the image to the right is probably where we're heading, I guess, in terms of how to integrate cyclists into roads that are really designed for capacity. So the image on the right is the Cyclops in Hume in Manchester, and it's probably one of the ones that's where it used to be a roundabout, and actually bringing in cyclists to still be able to navigate large junctions whilst trying to maintain capacity. Next slide, please, James. So just going back to the project development framework, I guess what we'd say. Right at the beginning, here are some examples in the local context where actually what shapes the strategy or the prioritization could quite easily be local issues. Needs to improve active travel, demands for wider footways, introducing new cycle connections and accessibility through estates or adopted local networks. Sometimes it could be on the edge of a hospital or a university. Otherwise, it could be in the city centre. But actually, there are competing flows. So it isn't necessarily just the introduction of active travel. It's sometimes also trying to think about how that changes flows within the network and what you might want to lose or remove in it to make that happen. And that takes quite a bit of strategic thinking at the outset, because we do need the support for this to happen. We need to have the right mandate, as Annie mentioned, and also then we do need to then think about what are the different factors that we need to start weighing up and what's going to take more weight. Next slide, please, James. As we then move into optioneering, and I'll just touch on a couple of slides around this, we do need to think about what could be the solutions, but really what's driving the change. So I've just given some examples here of how we could do. The strategic need might be, for example, as shown by the graph, that there's actually a significant increase in or demand in cycling and pedestrian movements. Something that's happened over time, and actually what the graph shows is quite consistent. So if we were then starting to look at addressing then this issue, then at this stage we might still be looking at lines on a drawing. We might be then thinking about strategic choices such as, what land is available? Do we stay within the highway? What are the key design lines for movement? What is the budget that could be made available? And that could then move on to, who are we likely to affect and who are the beneficiaries of the scheme, but also what are our key drivers? And what I've got there as a table showing there is effectively 4 different locations where improvements were being added on with the existing widths of a pedestrian cycle scheme. F being very uncomfortable. This is, and we will touch on guidance slightly on the next few slides. But what's slightly uncomfortable, then how do we improve this? And you might get to the point where actually some widening of a footpath gives you sufficiently what you need, but then you don't want to over widen, because then you start adding cost and you start adding disruption and you start then affecting how the carriage may operate. So there is a balancing act to go through in terms of what your needs are for the needs to satisfy the objectives of the scheme, as well as then thinking about cost and balancing, disrupting other factors. Next slide, please, James. So coming back to those development options again, this is certainly the stage that you would be thinking about still optioneering and what the different options are. So coming back to the crossing across the dual carriageway, but also you might want to then think about what is available to you. And whilst there may be a scheme and a need to get the best solution that might have some third-party land requirements, you might also then need to think about what does it look like without third-party land requirements, and that might be trying to achieve a certain gradient, a greater diversion and a travel distance, and then there's obviously timescales on the programme if CPO compulsory purchase orders are needed. But at the same time, there's a few other things that is worth looking ahead. So are there any departures from standards? So visibility displays might be a key issue, or turning radii or speeds, which might need to then be considered. So certainly on the more local level, there are a lot more of those levers to adjust. But it's worth looking at this during the development of the options, and particularly capturing it in a design log as you move forward, which is easier then to refer back to and revisit if there is a challenge or a particular objection from a stakeholder. Next slide, please. So moving into then preliminary design. So this is where you might start off with a simple image or lines on a drawing or a few blobs to indicate what that what the strategic solution is. And you then started to look into more detail and develop that design, looking at utilities maybe as part of that solution, what the design guide says, where you might want to move up, where you might need to balance a couple of different issues. Not one design guidance might have everything, and as time moves on through the design process, there's quite often new design guidance coming out. So I think this is where your starting position could vary quite significantly. But as it moves through design, there's public and statutory consultations to think about. There's cost program and budget to work within and cost constraints. There's approvals processes to start thinking about now. What do you put? What approvals would you need for the scheme? Do you think about phasing the scheme? Do you think about delivering schemes in different sections because they might have different timescales and approvals processes to go through? And that will certainly influence the design development of scheme moving forward. Next slide, then, please, James. Yeah, so as we then move into statutory procedures, now just be mindful that whilst you're undertaking preliminary design, that design might not close out until you've actually got statutory approval. So that this is then engaging with local authorities, going out to public consultation, potentially discussing with other statutory stakeholders and their processes, particularly if you bring maybe a bridge over a railway, or there's new connections needed for surface water runoff to the local authority water network, and also then starting to think about what traffic regulation orders you might need to change. This is where preliminary design then starts to be influenced quite significantly about what's your approach to delivery. But by this point, you tend to have a good design and a good idea in terms of what needs to be done. But just focusing a little bit more on local highway authority projects, even if it's a permitted development, local authorities still have process to go through, and Ali touched on that a little earlier. So there are technical approvals to obtain, which would include independent audits, whether it's safety or accessibility. There might be traffic regulation orders that need to be applied for. There are some controls in terms of what the deliverability of the scheme is, so whether Holden licenses need to be appointed or footway diversions. You need to think about what approvals you bring into place. So is this going to be delivered through a section 278? So you might be in a scenario where, even though it might be a local authority scheme, they've appointed a development partner to take the scheme forward, in which case it becomes a private entity that's engaging with the public highway authority, and there are some requirements required then to ensure that the right measures are being met. And as part of those agreements, there may be bonds and warranties. So what happens if the scheme isn't delivered, or it's complete, or the funding runs out? The local authority would generally want some sort of bond or collateral for them to be able to reinstate footways and carriageways to a level that's safe to operate the highway. And also your scheme at this stage starts to think about what are the community sums that the local authority might be looking at. So if you are switching from footway to carriageway, or carriageway to footway, or introducing new street lighting, or introducing new traffic signal equipment, there are usually a standard table from the highway authority that will set out what amounts they would be looking for them to maintain that for a certain lifespan, usually about 40 to 60 years, depending on what's being put forward. So there are further considerations there, and the earlier that is thought into the design, the less there are less risks on the risk register for the scheme moving forward. Next slide, please. So having then got to a sufficiently comfortable level of a design, starting to think about construction preparation. So that's then thinking about your procurement strategy, and whether that is to deliver the scheme with a traditional designer sitting on the client side and a contractor taking on delivery, or whether that's a design and build solution moving forward with the technical assurance sitting on the client side. So this is where you then also then think about warming up the market. You might want to then think about do you do a two-stage assessment, or whether you think about how the funding is split. So do you split the project into a couple of different portions of which might sit across different delivery bodies? So, for example, the local authority might want to deliver all the street lighting and the signals equipment, and you might then want to bring on a traditional contractor to deliver the civils and highways works in those instances. But then can't forget that we need to review these against the scheme objectives. So again, the scheme cost, business case, making sure if you're involved in a highway scheme that goes through a fairly traditional transport fund, this is where you would be seeking your full business case to obtain the approvals you need to release the funds to then appoint the contractor and then go into design delivery, which is usually a large chunk of that funding pot. That takes about 3 months. I've got a few timescales along the grey bar as you followed through to give you an indication of what that can take. Next slide, please, James. And then as we then move into construction and commissioning, the design doesn't stop there. So construction support and supervision, usually technical drawings and engineer sign-off, those things need to come forward. And as Ali mentioned on one of his previous slides, there's without doubt, always some unforeseen circumstances that appear. So the connection might not be right as previous drawings have shown, or the sewer might be deeper than expected, and or there might be ground issues that are too weak, so you're not getting a strong enough road foundation to build upon. So the construction design does need to think beyond that in terms of how those would be responded to, and how certain contingencies put aside for accounting for those on the client side. Continuous identification and input into risk registers, hazard risk registered, continuous interface and ongoing liaison with CDM, so both principal designer, principal contractor, the client organisation as well. And then at the end of handover, there's a role for the designer usually to complete the health and safety file, identifying any unusual or any special, measures that have been put in, such as spring-loaded, pre-cap, pre-stressed, concrete slabs, or how to potentially respond to maintenance and operational activities. And monitoring evaluation that comes in right at the end. And this isn't done by everyone, but a lot of the funds that we do work with do require this in some respect, whether it's a separate commission or whether it's from the design team. But right at the beginning of the strategy and shaping and prioritisation, there would normally be a strategy to set out how success is measured, what this scheme is going to deliver and what its aims and objectives are. And usually there's a period following then handover and completion where for a year or up to 5 years, that monitoring and evaluation could take place. So that would be linked to certainly the funding that's provided. I think that's our last slide for local improvements. James, can we move on to the next one? So for major highway schemes, again, if you just move to the next slide, I guess we've spoken about a theoretical project on a scale that's quite local. As we draw that up to major highway schemes, now usually when we're looking here, then everything changes in scale. And actually, depending on how disruptive or how remote or how close the scheme could be, one needs to think about whether a lot of the check-ins, a lot of the consultations, and a lot of the governance needs to be considered in a lot more detail. So public consultation, for example, might happen once on a small scheme or twice during the public application, a planning permission application, but on a major scheme, you might want to do that 3 or 4 times, starting off with non-statutory consultation right at the beginning when you're strategizing and optioneering to get a steer on what would be acceptable moving forward. So you're not having to then revisit and go back. And I've got early contractor involvement, which Ali's already mentioned. There might be an element of scoping, so having that conversation early with stakeholders, sharing. If it's a level, you might want a major scheme, you might be looking at a submission to PINs. If it's a more local scheme, you might be wanting to have a few more conversations with the internal stakeholders, with the local authority, highways authority, environmental officer around a steer on how that would work. Land assembly. So again, Is there any land take required? Are there potential discussions to happen around compulsory purchase orders? What worked on a scheme a couple of years ago where an active travel improvement scheme took out more or less everyone's front gardens. That was a challenge, and therefore actually trying to approach a landowner for their car park or a shed, which they might be operating out of and quite happy to sell, can become a bit of a challenging conversation, knowing that this is quite important to the scheme. So I think there's a sensitivity around identifying those needs very early and then thinking about how you approach stakeholders and interested parties. Environmental footprint, so habitats, ecology. Normally a preliminary environmental assessment appraisal is done at that stage, but that could have an influence on the scheme moving forward. And whether an EIA is likely. So a lot of schemes do go forward with a screening notes depending on its size or depending on its influence. So those might be things that on a major scheme you want to think about. Approvals process tend to differ. So it might not be permitted development. It's probably most unlikely it's going to be permitted development if it's a new build scheme. So Town and Country Planning Act, DCOs, local development orders and town transport work tax orders may be the way to go. And therefore having that very early consultation around the importance of the scheme and what it might be approved through then directs the design team to move towards adopting certain standards. Other project interfaces, so are other projects nearby, what are you likely to cross over? I'm involved in a scheme at the moment, which again, same client, but two different schemes. How does that work in terms of health and safety? How does that work in terms of deliverability? Further conversations around that. Funding gateways, sounding boards. So sounding boards are interesting. You get that with a lot more local schemes now, where there's a quality panel or a design panel set up on the client side or the stakeholder side, on the approvals body, and that needs planning in terms of what you want to present, what might be the sticking points, what's likely to get pushed back. And I'd just probably go on to the last one, which is depending on, again, challenges faced by the project and the size of the project, interdisciplinary design reviews, interdisciplinary working workshops, constraints, and thematic working groups. These are things that could be also set up to help with delivery. Again, it comes down to the scale of the project. So if you are going from a local to a major project, you might want to start thinking about these things a lot more. I think that's our second to last slide. So the next one, I think maybe back to you, Ali, just to summarise for us.
Yeah, thanks, Javed. So yeah, I kind of, in wrapping up, I was thinking, how do you wrap up? We've covered quite a lot. Hopefully some of it, well, hopefully all of it was useful, but hopefully some of it was kind of resonated with people. But my takeaways from today was, or in preparing this was, transport schemes are generally complex with multiple stakeholders, and you do need a variety of approvals. A lot of these approvals have statutory procedures and timeframes associated with them. So, one of the key things is to ensure they're considered and programmed in from the outset. So you've got a really robust program and you've thought about them all. The impact of the schemes are often broader than transport, and I think it is important that although it might be a highway scheme, that we do think kind of outside the box. What's it really trying to deliver? It might be an active travel scheme, but it might actually, the benefits might be, getting some of those local businesses, outdoor seating area. It might be creating areas of public realm. So just thinking creatively, I think, about the outcomes you're trying to achieve with some of these and thinking broader than transport is really important. I do think that it's important that you get experienced technical advice early in the project to ensure you can prepare that comprehensive and robust both project plan, think about the governance arrangements, and that you've got a really robust program and cost plan, and that you can keep developing that as the scheme progresses. And then also stakeholders, that you have a really well thought out stakeholder plan, that you understand what the different views are and priorities, to both try and minimise objections, but ultimately hopefully get schemes understood and supported by those stakeholders. Because often I find that people object if they don't really know or understand it. So getting that early stakeholder involvement can take a bit longer, but can be really, really important in terms of getting that the success of the scheme. So that was the end. We did overrun a little bit. Apologies about that. I did envisage it. The good news is, which I put in the chat, is we didn't have 70 slides.